This is a radio broadcast addressed from the League of Nations on the global war effort against the Morgana threat, where we report the recent happenings amongst the major nations contributing to the defense of our united front. I am your speaker, Ammaraglio Maus, but you may refer to me as Commissar, or simply the Speaker, whichever you or your government prefers. It is now week 2 of November, and tensions seem to be on the rise yet again, as the major powers begin to make plays against one another. The Zurich Conference also began this week, and while it was hoped to bring an end to much of the nation's squabbling, it was not spared from the growing tensions, and likely reaffirmed the stance in which the great powers previously had. First up, news from the League itself, and the much-awaited Zurich Conference. The Zurich Conference was only a couple days old, and was already promising to be quite productive. However, in an unfortunate turn of events, Joseph Avenel, the Secretary-General of the League of Nations, fell down a flight of stairs while in consultation with the French delegation. Later in the week, he resigned given his inability to return to his duties. Jean Lester, his deputy, was sworn in as the Secretary-General directly after. To the Allies, Secretary-General Avenel had seemed very much like an Axis sympathizer. To Germany and Italy, his compliance and lack of leadership were a symbol of everything that had doomed the League to begin with. Due to the influence of the captain, however, the conference continued in spite of his absence. It was reported that a major part of why the proceedings went as smoothly as they did was that an early attempt by Polish nationalists to force their way into the event and appeal for justice and independence was swiftly quashed by the Swiss police. It seemed likely to almost everyone in attendance that their plans had been leaked from within. The message, however, was heard loud and clear in Finland, the Balkans, and elsewhere in the world. The League of Nations had long been at the mercy of the major powers, and it seemed that even in this brief moment of international accord, that much, at least, had not changed. A push was made to discuss peace in Europe under Hitler's conditions, but in this audience it fell upon deaf ears. Perhaps more progress can still be made in the upcoming meetings. However, the League might need to take a firmer stance when it comes to protecting the middle and minor powers. Following that important update from the League comes news from the Allies. This week, sources report that the Belgians had confidentially informed the Dutch and the Allies at Zurich that they had received uncertain intelligence on German plans. Said plans were stated to involve an attack on the Low Countries with a timetable as soon as next week. It was in this spirit of crisis that the French again renewed plans for common defensive planning, interior fortifications, and limited basing rights for the army in the Low Countries. Through the war plan, the accords are strengthened. The inclusion of the Netherlands meant that the defensive lines would be drawn on the Dial River, with strong land defenses erected to defend Amsterdam and Rotterdam in a line north from Breda. This effort also had the additional benefit of preserving the ports of the Low Countries for the Allies in case they were required. The key issue, however, was basing rights. Despite intelligence to the contrary, there was some hope that Germany's promise to respect Dutch and Belgian neutrality would be kept. But the entry of the French and British armies into Belgium and the Netherlands would be an outright provocation to the Germans. The only thing the Allied powers could do now was to wait and see. In other news, the Finnish delegation in London was received favorably, and was assured that the Allies would aid them in the event of war with the Soviet Union. While Prime Minister Chamberlain would give no guarantees, war materials and loans were still a possibility. After that comes news from the Axis, more specifically Germany. Germany could not afford an enemy to the south. Pressure had to be put on Prince Paul of Yugoslavia to enter into an accord with Berlin instead of Rome. And as such, it was announced that the diplomatic play-Hungarian option would be enacted, attempting to utilize Hungary's army by moving them away from Romania's border and toward Yugoslavia's. Hungarian revanchism could wait temporarily. The Magyar Király Honvédség would be needed to ensure that Yugoslavia joined the German sphere. The Hungarian buildup at the border would also serve as a starting point in discussion with Mussolini the next time they would meet. After that comes news from the Comintern, more particularly the Soviet Union, who attempted to make quite the statement to the world this week. As it was, the Soviet Union urged its friends abroad, particularly in the United States and those among the Allies, to portray Hitler's peace plan in the Zurich Conference as an example of the peaceful intentions of Germany, and the Allied government's behavior as bellicosity and greed. They were instructed to seize the opportunity presented by the conference and push for an immediate peace between the Allies and Germany under Hitler's conditions, those being immediate disarmament and cessation of hostilities. Sources say that one Soviet delegate really attempted to drive the point home. The fall of Poland was nothing compared to the horror of the new alien threat, went the rhetoric. Even the heroic captain of the Skagerrak Strait seemed to be saying as much. This message was received somewhat positively in France and the United States, but in Britain the message was received as cynical hypocrisy. Following the example of Orwell, the fellow travelers of Britain seem increasingly disinclined to follow the party line. Following the announcements from the world's factions comes news from Italy, who continues to be the world's leading nation in combating the Morgana threat. This week, the Regia Marina announced the enactment of War Plan Regeneration, which found 82% support among captains. The Regia Marina finally conceded they could push exhausted crews and damaged ships no further without a period of rest and recovery, as well as repair and refits for the ships that have valiantly defended Italy that had been, to this point, held together by sheer will and determination. As a result, there could be no question of helping Franco at the Balearic Islands, much to Gambara's dismay. The rewards of returning to port were immediately clear, however. It wasn't just that the fighting men and women of the Regia Marina were allowed to catch their breaths for the first time since September. Sailors on shore leave told stories of their adventures at sea and of their angelic belles. Sources say that even RN Kimichanira and RN Pola became sweet-tempered in the tellings, and another wave of civilians ran to the recruiters begging for a chance to join. However, they told fewer tales of the tragedy that happened at the naval base of La Maddalena, which was almost completely demolished by a large force of vanities that came from the west. Reports state that they lingered in the vicinity, bombarding the base and town long enough for Cagliari's submarine squadrons to reach them. The submarines RN Dandolo and RN Diosporo succeeded in penetrating the Morgana screen and sunk two of the vanities, but they were unfortunately caught and destroyed in the process. The Morgana left soon after, leaving the island nearly in ruins, but by strange coincidence, the only structure undamaged was the Villa Weber, which escaped unharmed from even splinters. Perhaps this was a sign that not everything would be lost, despite the seemingly overwhelming odds against them. After that, we head across the Atlantic to hear news from the United States, who surpassed the United Kingdom to become the second leading nation in our war against the Morgana threat. This week, after much deliberation, the United States announced the enactment of the War Plan Cowardice's Cost, which found 75% majority in Congress and the House of Representatives. With this, the United States Navy adopted a convoy scheme modeled on their counterpart across the Atlantic. Heavily escorted on this side of the ocean, merchant shipping to Europe would now generally be free of predation. One immediate benefit was that the largest group of cowardices that had been squawking along the eastern seaboard for the better part of a month grew too bold and found themselves under the guns of part of the returning Atlantic fleet. In a testament to their speed, they had to chase them all the way from the mouth of Potomac to the Bay of Fundy, where reports state that they reportedly appealed to the Canadians for sanctuary before turning their guns on the Grand Banana Island in a fit of pique. The wound to the Navy's reputation was at long last closed, and celebrations in Ottawa were almost as wild as those in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, sedition was still free of the American net, and if her survival was less of an embarrassment to the Navy than cowardices had been, well, it wasn't clear that she was doing less to damage American morale. In the great cities of the East Coast, people heard her radio broadcasts and concluded that she was speaking in code, that she was reaching out to collaborators, and that a fifth column was becoming an ever more immediate threat to their security. Sources say that people watched their neighbors with suspicion. Perhaps in some cases it was even justified. However, her voice was balanced out by that of America's most beloved belle, and one of my personal favorites, USS Constitution, the guardian of Boston Harbor herself. Her letters to the nation were read aloud everywhere. Even Franklin Delano Roosevelt would quote from them on his radio broadcast, and an anxious nation listened, and was reassured. Following that, we head across the Pacific to hear news from the Empire of Japan, who has become the third contributing nation to our united front, also surpassing the United Kingdom with their recent efforts. This week, IJN Kasumi and those of the ships gathered at Tokyo Bay for the Emperor's grand procession were sent on a very conspicuous path to Chinese waters, signaling that the Emperor's eyes had not turned from the grand project on the mainland just yet. Prime Minister Yunai's government, as well as the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy, were united in this. Storm clouds, however, continued to gather, and it had become clear that the attack by the Chinese army was not a mere skirmish, but rather a full multi-front assault on Japanese positions. The Imperial Japanese Army, surprised that the Chinese army would be capable of an offensive action after the Battle of Changsha, was in the midst of reorganizing and resupplying a quite precarious situation. It was clear that no favorable terms could be concluded on the continent if the Chinese assault could not be broken. As with his predecessors, Prime Minister Yunai's prestige was tied to the situation in China. Foreign observers noted the resilience of the Chinese as well. IJN Kasumi's destination was reported to be Shanghai, and the passage was uneventful until she attempted to raise the city. Approaching from the north was a flotilla of Funayuri from the Yellow Sea, who, upon sighting her, reports state, turned tail and ran without firing a single shot. IJN Kasumi's strength and the fear she brought to the Morgana were the toast of the city for a week. A small delegation sent by Prime Minister Yunai stepped away from the pageantry of her arrival to ensconce themselves at a Japanese club in Hongkou. What their business was in Shanghai soon became the subject of rumor and speculation. Further south, however, even as the scouting fleet neared Formosa, the Funayuri delusion, following whispered advice only she could hear, drifted into the South China Sea. Who or what she was following was unknown, but it's unlikely anything good could come of it. Following that, we head back over to Europe to hear news from Germany, who, in a surprising but not wholly unwelcome turn of events, has become the fourth contributing member in combating the Morgana threat through recent substantial efforts. This week, Kriegsmarine captains in the Baltic Sea received unusual orders from Berlin in the form of the war-planned Whispers from Hell. Given the outrage that ORP Orzo's escape had inspired the week before, some Kriegsmarine officers even suspected this to be a political trap. But it was what it was. The Morgana were building strange devices along the Hel Peninsula and into the eastern Baltic, possibly as part of Starvation's strange campaign against the Soviets, and the ships of the Kriegsmarine were ordered to observe without interfering. Their forbearance had at least temporary dividends. The enemy raided Lithuania, Latvia, and Sweden rather than Germany, and the devices were clearly manipulating the weather. The unseasonable warmth and dry winds as far south as District Krakow suited the year quite nicely. The sailors who had been fighting in the Baltic for months may have felt that giving the Morgana a chance to dig in was folly, but their opinions didn't count for much just then. Meanwhile, the Oberkommando der Marine was looking back out at the North Sea and the Atlantic, where they could take advantage of the disruption to the Allied blockades after Skagerrak. As expected, the Royal Navy had retired to Scapa Flow and Rosyth, and the resulting losses to Allied shipping were the highest since the war began. On the 14th of November, orders to cancel leave and be prepared to get underway were received by ships in port, as well as those returning from patrols. However, by the 9th the orders were rescinded. Rumors held that it was all to prepare for action on the Western Front, but only time would hold that answer. In other news, on November 8th, a carefully placed time bomb detonated at the Berger Bräukeller in Munich just a few minutes after Hitler finished a speech there. Only an accident of timing kept him from being one of the fatalities, and the lead suspect in the bombing, Johann George Elser, was captured at the Swiss border later that evening. A day later, in a striking counterintelligence coup, the SD captured a pair of British intelligence agents on the fringes of the Dutch town of Venlo, mere meters from the German border. This was considered an enormous success, and it was hard not to gloat over the political earthquake in London that occurred when the depth of the deception was finally revealed. The cost was the protest of the Dutch ambassador in Berlin over the violation of the border. He reportedly was met with silence. After that, we head west, past the North Sea, to turn our attention to the United Kingdom, who is the fifth contributing member to the war against the Morgana. In the wake of the Battle of Skagerrak, and seizing the chance while Morgana activity in the North Sea was sharply diminished, the British Admiralty directed the home fleet to retire, repair, and rest. The largest and mightiest navy in the world wouldn't be defeated because it was careless about maintenance, said one admiral, who also continued to state that while it did mean that the Morgana in the North Sea would have time to recover, it still wasn't a choice that anyone in the Royal Navy regretted. This also meant that the Germans, sensing weakness, grew bolder, and as a result it did not take long for the U-boats to yet again hunt in the approaches, nor did the light screen the Allies had in place deter surface raiders of various types. Meanwhile, on November 9th, reports state that 2 British intelligence agents were seized by the Germans in Western Holland in a daring counterintelligence coup. It was a humiliation, an ongoing security risk, and for certain members of the British government it was proof that Prime Minister Chamberlain had not outgrown his naivete in face of the German threat. The Secret Intelligence Service, weathering the political firestorm, took pains to ensure that this could never happen again. My friend in the SIS, who was given prior permission to disclose this information, reported this would be done through the intelligence plan fortification. They would vet every source, double-check every rumor, and commit no resources to any lead that was anything short of ironclad, at least as it pertains to wars waged by humans. It is rumored that the staff of Pembroke VII had a very different set of guidelines in this regard. Following that, we head across the channel to hear news from France, the 6th contributing member in combating the Morgana threat. This week, and early in the morning of November 4th, the Marine Nationale received reports that an already dire situation in West Africa had gotten vastly worse. By nightfall, the forced raid was underway, following the orders of war plans securing Dakar, which found 65% support. Though by then, Paris and Rome were receiving desperate calls from the Franco regime pleading for help at Majorca. The French couldn't assist, however. Dakar and the other parts of the Africa Occidental Française had to be their first priority. But Spanish sources soon spoke with terror about strange lights and low howling sounds from Majorca. Everyone feared that worse was to come. Meanwhile, the Morgana were driven back southward from the waters around Dakar, and the half-hearted push in the Senghor River came to nothing. Scattered reports suggested the presence of German AMCs in the early stages of the battle, though in what capacity they fought was unclear. The fleet steamed westward following their counter by Dakar, intending to hunt the raiders in the South Atlantic. Reports stated the situation wasn't so happy in the French Antilles. American forces had pushed a significant venom presence away from the Puerto Rican Trench the week prior, but the surviving enemy hadn't fled that far. Over the course of the week, Morgana forces gathered near Martinique, plundering whatever they could reach. The Americans, preoccupied with a cowardice plague near the Potomac, were reportedly in no position to assist the French. Lastly, we turn our attention to the northeast to hear news from our comrades in the Soviet Union, who are the 7th contributing nation to our united front. Earlier this week, on November 3rd, the Soviet Baltic Fleet acted upon the war plan Light Touch, following a tip from a secret source, where they stopped and searched the Finnish ship Suomen Poika off the shores of Tallinn. There they found a strange half-alive Morgana technology hidden in the deepest corners of the hold, where sources say the Finnish sailors could avoid looking at it for too long. The Finns said that they had loaded the cargo from an Argentinian steamer off the coast of Hamburg. However, the Soviets had reason to believe that the Morgana had offered the Finns support in case of war, and this was their proof. The Soviets decided not to announce the discovery to the League of Nations at first, but rather they confiscated what sources referred to as squirming metal things, and assured the Finns that a deal on the border could still be had, and under reasonable security terms for both parties. No mention was made of this discovery to Finland either, reports say, but Helsinki must have been aware the moment that the Suomen Poika did not make port. Later on Thursday the 9th, Paasikivi and Stalin met again, and the Finnish response given was, quote, "Finland cannot grant a foreign military power bases either on its territory or within its borders," end quote. Deadlocked, the men cordially disbanded. Rumor has it, though, that Paasikivi could be seen arguing with another member of his delegation after the proceedings had ended, though what it was about is unknown. And with that concludes the League of Nations War Report for Week 2 of November. While on the surface, things seem to be getting better, In reality, this week has been rather rough for our united front. Many middle and smaller nations are being ignored while the majors seem to have simply observed from a distance. If we are truly to form a united front for the betterment of humanity's future, we must not forget those who stand in the shadows. And as a reminder to all captains and citizens alike that this League of Nations broadcast is intended on keeping you informed about the unified war effort against the Morgana. But there is more you can do than just listen. Consider donating some much-needed war bonds to help our boys and girls on the ocean stay afloat so they can finish the job. Doing so will net you prestige among your peers that you captains in particular can utilize to gain more resources, dock and harbor space, and personnel for your own war efforts so that you too can continue fighting the good fight in your own way. Thank you for listening, and may you have smooth seas.